Great. Welcome everyone to our latest edition of the Great Reads Book Club at Mediate.com. Wonderful to have all of you here. This is one of my favorite series that we do. We have so many great books in the field, and we have so few opportunities to really get a deep dive with the authors. And I'm delighted that our installation today is one of my favorite books in the past few years, Dispute Systems Design. And we have two of the authors here, Jan and Lisa, and we are going to be hosted by the legendary Howard Gadlin. So I'm just going to turn it over to Howard and kick us off. So Howard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, and welcome everyone. Peter Adler always says, whoever it is that shows up is the right people to show up. So we will just get started. So I'm quite enthused about the opportunity to talk about this book, but I thought it might make sense before we even get into that to just ask Lisa and Janet to give their overview of what dispute systems design is, just to frame it that way, especially anticipating that there may be some people who are not completely familiar with dispute system design. I thought that would be a good way to begin.
To define our terms. Yes. Okay. So Lisa and I have a different angle in we and Stephanie. So the three of us all came into this area by different paths. And so it may have different meaning for us. I came at it from my dissertation work on the World Trade Organization. And I noticed that the same issues were being negotiated and then struggled for implementation, and then were submitted for enforcement. And I thought there should be a relationship between those processes because they're all dealing with the same people and the same issues. So that's how I came to thinking about system design. And I think system design has come to be a term that basically just captures a deliberation by the participants or users to say, what is the process we have in place? Why do we have it? What are we seeking for it to accomplish? And then can we measure that success over time? So I think it's the deliberation, and that's why we'd like to open up the topic of system design more broadly, because many people are doing it, they just don't name it that way. And also more often, I think it is a matter of redesign. There's something already in place, the status quo, and so it may be a redesign challenge of coming up with a system that's better.
And Lisa, do you have something you would say about that?
Yeah, my way in was completely different. I mean, that's one of the strengths of the team, is that our perspectives were so entirely different. I was a double major in philosophy and ancient Greek in college, and I fell in love with Hegel, and then went to law school and fell in love with labor law because it looked like, to me, Hegel instantiated, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and this constant dynamic. And so I was a labor lawyer for a decade, representing school boards and municipalities before I became an academic. And I cared about democracy at the workplace. Even though I was representing management, it was public sector management. I had worked for a union. And so when I came into the field of dispute resolution, it was Spider, and there were many colleagues there who had come in through labor law. And then I started doing research because I was in a tenure track job in the O'Neill School of Public Affairs. And I was a big fan of arbitration. I was by then a labor mediator and a labor arbitrator. And I didn't understand what the beef was about non-union mandatory adhesive arbitration. So I started doing empirical work on it. And that's how, over a series of studies, I became deeply concerned about fairness and justice in non-union mandatory arbitration. And that's what brought me into the systems issue, because the system was the problem. There was no repeat player representing employees. They were one-shot players, as Mark Lelanter would call them in his famous Why the Haves come out ahead article. And meanwhile, corporations were repeat players with infinitely more resources. And the results, the outcomes of these arbitrations showed that there was a problem, I thought. And during about that time, I got cut off from access to the data by a change in management at the AAA. And I started doing work on mediation with the Postal Service. And this whole question of how the Postal Service was going to design this project, it started out as a pilot in the Florida Panhandle, three cities. And then it spread out to 25 cities. And I got involved literally the day it started in 1994 in terms of evaluation. And I was able to apply procedural justice methodology to evaluating the program. And when we were asked by the Postmaster General to come up with a nationwide rollout, and I was not the designer, I was just the evaluator. But my concern was we already had cases where federal agencies had asked for mediators to apply for rosters in EEO cases. And they'd asked the mediators to share their settlement rate. And that scared the bejesus out of me, frankly, because if you've got one employer designing a mediation system, picking all the mediators, paying all the mediators, assigning them to cases, it's going to look like a setup. It's going to look potentially like it's a biased system. And if the mediators have the right to tell people the strengths and weaknesses of their cases, it could trash the experiment. So I recommended that Cindy read the Bush and Folger book, which was brand new at the time, and they adopted the transformative model because it was against the ethics of that model to tell people who might win. And so all of that was, I was coming into design, not intellectually, but on the ground.
So it's interesting, you have, the two of you have very different paths. And how did the two of you plus Stephanie, how did you come together to work on this project? You're coming from such different approaches.
Lisa, I'll let you go first.
Stephanie and I got to talking about dispute system design at an ABA section of dispute resolution conference. Now, whether it was 2006 or 2007, I don't recall. I vividly recall sitting with her at a conference table, drinking coffee in the, exhibitor hall and talking about there needs to be a book.
And
Well,
there wasn't one.
And I think there was a symposium at Harvard shortly about then that was on system design, and Lisa, you presented, and I think Stephanie and I presented, and so we had an opportunity to write an article based on that. And actually it is really perfect that Howard is hosting us today, because Stephanie reminded me that she and Maud Prevere started their class at Stanford, and Howard was their first expert visitor on system design. So Howard, this is a full circle that you're able to lead us today in the conversation. But I also was at that ABA conference, and Stephanie and I just thought, well, let's start with an article after Lisa saying a book. That was way too big. So we started with an article that really captured our framework. And then the three of us thought together that we could put together a book.
Before we get more into the substance of the book, people might be curious to know a bit of how you worked on the book. Did you each get a chapter to work on and then the others serve as editors? Did you do collective writing? I've just gone through a process like that. So other people may have tried collaborating with other authors. It's a complex, life-changing relationship.
Exactly. That's a true statement, Howard. So Stephanie and I are both in the Bay Area, and we taught together at Stanford. And so it was physically easy for us to see each other and then practice what we preached every year with our class. And with Lisa in Indiana, we really needed to be purposeful. And someone suggested, and in retrospect, they were right, we should have, set aside a week every year and just spent physical time together, because I think the back and forth, you can accomplish the mechanics online with emails and drafts and that sort of thing. But the thinking together in the same room without time constraints is a real luxury, but it's also the input for a quality thought, things that you could talk about rather than just say, Lisa, write that chapter, Jan, write that chapter. So of the book, the first 6 chapters, the foundation, we all worked on. Some of us took different lead or on the first drafts, but we all read all of them, and we're trying to make them coherent for setting up all the case chapters. And then we each took the lead on several of the case chapters, and then the others read it and gave feedback. Lisa?
Lisa, anything else you wanted to say about that?
There were times when I was, there was a semester I was visiting at Hastings. There was a semester I was visiting at the Center for Law and Society at Berkeley. And then I was coming to California during breaks in the summer.
Yeah.
So there were opportunities to meet in Jan's wonderful home in the marina with an incredible view of water out the window and incredibly comfortable kitchen. And of course, there was always food, which is a great thing. But really, we needed a mediator, and Jan played the role as mediator. I mean, with 3 authors with completely different perspectives, Stephanie coming out of the court context and her tremendous work with Kaiser, she had helped set up on the Blue Ribbon Commission a new arbitration system for Kaiser after the California Supreme Court found there to be significant problems with their existing system. And so from her perspective, it was possible to set up a fair arbitration system. But by the time we were talking about it, I was more in the Gene Sternlight camp. And so we didn't initially even write a chapter on arbitration. And the book went out for review without that chapter. And the reviewer said, "What are you thinking? It's not here. I mean, why isn't it here?" And so it was one of the last things we added in when we got consensus on how to approach it. So there was always this question of building conceptual consensus. And the other thing that I was concerned about is I had written an article for another symposium on dispute system design entitled Designing Justice, and it was very important. So there had to, from my standpoint, there were 3 chunks of intellectual framing. There was the Stephanie and Jan's article, which they had invited me to co-author. And I said, sorry, I haven't been teaching this class, your job. And besides, I had the Postal Service to publish in that symposium. So there was that article and the framework, which is a huge thing to frame all the chapters. But then we wanted this to be a book, not only for lawyers, but for people in business schools, policy schools, political scientists, sociologists, social psychologists. We wanted it to be very interdisciplinary. Yeah. So the framing from the Ostrom workshop here in Bloomington, Eleanor Ostrom won the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, even though her degree was in political science, and she framed herself as a political economist. And so that the institutional analysis and development framework is a larger scale way to frame any institution. And she, in her writing about that, had talked about the need for conflict resolution systems in management of conflict in common pool resources, but she hadn't written about it. So part of it was the book was filling that gap. And then the justice piece was the other important framing. I mean, it's not a neutral book, it's a normative book.
Right.
Justice has to be part of the thinking on system design.
Yeah. I can testify to the fact that the book appeals to people who are not lawyers. I mean, it's very interdisciplinary in its perspective. It's not at all dependent upon the reader being immersed in a particular select literature of any one academic field. And you've done that really well, I think. I'm curious, just one last thing about sort of as designers of dispute systems, when you began working together, did you initially decide that you needed to have a mediator as disagreements arose, or did Jan's role just sort of evolve out of from among the interactions among the three of you?
Well, Jan was always the leader in terms of convening us, setting up meetings. And so she sort of naturally, it felt to me like it was a natural role for her to take, but I don't know how she felt about it.
I didn't think about it in those terms. I just, I suppose I was happy to host it and organize it. And from a deal maker, I like to have the draft control and I like to have the meeting control. And so that's probably what led me to down this path.
Yeah, it might not be mediator. It might have been facilitator. It might have been the better role.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I was asking that because when I work with scientific teams that are working on collaborations, among the things we press them to do at the very outset is to address how they will handle disagreements when they arise. The idea being that the time to decide how you're going to handle disagreements is while you're still getting along. If you wait until you get past that point, that's much more challenging. One of the things I want to underline about the book is its scope. And I mean, I was trying to figure out, it's not really a textbook. I mean, it's much more of a resource than a textbook. It's sort of like a textbook with soul or something like that. I mean, it doesn't only focus on the mechanics of dispute system design or its potential as a cost-effective approach to managing people in organizations, but equally, as Lisa was underlining, on the humane purposes that can be served by designing thoughtful dispute systems. And that differentiates it from almost everything else I've ever read about dispute system design. No, I don't know of anyone else who so thoroughly incorporates that into the focus on fairness and justice, which you bring up repeatedly at important points in the book. And the interesting thing is, I think your discussions have implications for practitioners who do nothing similar to dispute system design, to people who do divorce mediation or mediation in community settings. The book moves you towards thinking about fairness and justice, to thinking about considerations of power and how power is wielded and distributed. And I think that's one of the really important contributions of the book. The other thing, and I think you have the slide for that, Jan, is the other thing that you do in the book, and I'll be honest in talking about this, you have a coherent analytic framework so that each of the areas of dispute system design that you discuss, and maybe you can give people a sense of how, of what those areas are, better come from you than me. Each of them is subjected through the same framework for analysis. can we post that slide? I think we had that.
Jan, you're on mute.
We're not hearing you, Jan. You're muted.
Oh, okay. Here I come. All right. So the link to the book flyer that Colin put in the chat, if you go to the flyer, you will see there's an outline of the book, and chapter 2 includes the framework. But I'll go through the elements here. So there's 6 elements in the framework that we designed. It had many more elements early on, but I suggested that more was not better. So we tried to shrink it down to initially 5, and then we added context and culture. So the 6 elements are goals, which I think overall is the most important of the elements in the framework, because unless you are really clear about what you're trying to accomplish with the system and one or more processes, you won't know if you've been successful or not. Second is stakeholders, who's affected, who cares about this system and is a user or participant in it. We added context and culture as a key shaper of what the system needed to be for the particular people and population. Processes and structure, how they relate to each other, whether you have any resources, and whether it's an accountable and successful system. So in thinking about the goals, focused on what do the system's decision makers seek to accomplish. And decision makers, as Lisa will touch on in the power and control comments, is really critical. And so the decision makers might be inside an institution. It may be a blue ribbon panel. The decision makers may be a diverse set of possibilities. And what kinds of conflicts is the system trying to address? And sometimes the diversity of conflicts suggests that focusing on one particular subset would be helpful to get your arms around what the issues are, what the challenges are, and what would be a successful combination of processes. Stakeholders, who are affected, what is their power, what are their interests, just a basic interest analysis as with any dispute resolution process. Context and culture, thinking about, is this something like 9/11, where designing a claims facility has to be done quickly, it's urgent, it's hugely a lot of injury and damage that needs to be addressed and compensated. So I think the culture, whether we're in a harmonious, more collaborative culture, whether you're in a more hierarchical culture, these choices and these kinds of organizational profiles would make a big difference in what kind of system would be effective. The processes and structure, there are a whole array of processes that are available: direct negotiation, facilitation, bringing in third-party facilitators, mediators, arbitrators then in court, where the third party controls both the process and the outcome. So how do these processes get designed? And now more recently, is there an online version of these processes? And is that preferable or feasible or accessible? So if there's one or more processes, how do those processes relate to each other? How do they relate to the formal legal system in the court? And are they integrated or sequenced? Who decides? To the Howard's previous point, so much better to design your system when you're in the process of looking at the substantive procedures and content and players. I've been working with California groundwater processes for the last few years, and was really looking at whether the governance documents for a water basin included some kind of dispute resolution process. And sometimes it did, sometimes they didn't. But a lot of the I would say motivator of having those processes is not, like Howard suggested, when you're feeling friendly and optimistic about your future, best to say, how are we going to deal with problems when they arise? And often they just figure that's lawyer talk, and it's just going to mess us up, and it's going to make us feel adversarial. So let's not talk about it. And then others, I have really talented mediators that are guiding the process in groundwater particularly. And they were able to negotiate really thoughtful terms in essentially a dispute resolution system into the underlying jurisdictional and governance documents. So it really varies about when these processes are designed, and also more thoughtfully whether they intervene early on to prevent disputes, as well as manage disputes and resolve them in the long run. So I think the scope of process options is really broad, and it's worth the conversation about that choice. Resources is just that the technical, financial, and human resources that are available will determine the success of that system. So if you design the most wonderful system with 5-stepped processes, but you have a bicycle budget, it's not going anywhere. It will fail, and it will maybe make it worse than status quo was. So I think the really focusing early on what is available in terms of these different resources, and ensuring that the system operates and can be successful. And then lastly, thinking about how transparent the system is. Can the users and stakeholders understand how does it work? When can I speak? When can I get an answer? Who's going to make the answer? Is there a monitoring, learning, and evaluation phase that allows the designers to revisit their system over time and assess its success and accountability? Lisa, do you want to add on into any of the framework elements?
Sorry, I muted myself, so you couldn't hear my chair creak here.
Okay.
The things I would like to add are that implicit in the goals section of the framework is justice, some form of justice. And in the Designing Justice article, I had identified 35 different definitions from across multiple disciplines for forms of justice. So you think about substantive justice, I mean, income inequality, equity, the greatest good for the greatest number, or procedural justice as applied in courts, having to do with voice and a respectful process, or as applied in organizations, organizational justice, having to involve sharing information. And then there's community justice. So we think of restorative justice as a form of community justice. So there were many different definitions depending on, and that would be implicit in the goals of a system for the decision maker, and that we touched on to some extent in various chapters, for example, in the evaluation chapter. The evaluation chapter also is implicitly incorporated in the transparency and accountability and success piece of the framework. Because how do you know whether something is working? How do you keep a system accountable to the people who use it? And so the experience that I had had as the national director of the Redress Evaluation Project for 12 years was relevant to how we thought about the measurement and sharing of information with the users of a system. Then the other piece of it within stakeholders and decision makers, implicit is the question of who's got control over system design. And I had, before I met Jan, I had been publishing, and I'd met Stephanie because she was my officer at the Hewlett Foundation. I met Stephanie in 1998, I think. And so this question of control became important when you think about non-union adhesive mandatory arbitration, right? Who's got control over designing the arbitration system? We were seeing in the early days of mandatory arbitration significant abuses. No, you're not allowed to, you have to come to arbitration, but no, you're not allowed to bring a lawyer. And we're shifting the cost, unlike the American rule where everybody pays their attorney's fees. If you lose, you pay our fees. And there's a great video about this, if you haven't seen it, done by Robert Reich, Lost in the Fine Print, where students of a for-profit higher education institution lost in arbitration and had to pay $600,000 in the other side's attorney's fees, which, bankrupts people. So these are all design things, but who's got control over putting that piece into the design? And then what does it do to how the design functions and the outcomes of the system? And so all of that, if you think about who's got control, one party control in mandatory arbitration and in the Postal Service system of redress. They didn't have to negotiate over that system. It wasn't a mandatory subject of bargaining under Alexander versus Gardner Denver. It was for an EEO complaint stream. But then there's great bilateral systems like labor arbitration, labor grievance procedures, but also the Fortune 1000 and the CPR Institute and how they together negotiate the rules they're going to use with each other. And then you have third-party designs like the courts, right? So like Stephanie's experience is at the Northern District for California,
Yeah.
that she was involved in that system. So if it's a third party, their interest, who have total control over the system, like a court, well, what are their goals and interests? They may have one heck of a docket that they need to clear out, right? And they can't necessarily afford to pay for mediators. So that's why control became important, and it's illustrated in the appendix to the book.
So listening to Jan and Lisa underlines again for me the power of the analytic framework that they established and the kind of comparative mindset it introduces the reader to. So as you're going, because after they lay out their framework, then they get into case studies. So it's not just a discussion of these abstract principles in the framework, but then there are examples in each of them. So you're reading about public and community justice systems, you're reading about courts, you're reading about claims, you're reading about community programs, you're reading about labor, employment, arbitration, commercial, consumer, and there's much more. I won't list all of the things that are covered. But as a reader, at first, when I went from the first of the chapters in that section of the book to the next, I was thinking, oh, this is sort of redundant because we just talked about goals and how different can the goals be from this to the next one. And then I'm reading and I read, oh, this is the brilliance of the book. This is where it forces you to think comparatively. And if you've come in with some notion of what justice in your particular processes, the way you normally think about it, I guarantee this will shake up your thinking about what justice is and any of the other things that we're talking about. So it's part of what makes the book so, for me, makes it so valuable. The other thing is the case examples, because it's one thing that there are a lot of people, a lot of writing in the broadly speaking mediation conflict resolution field iterates a variety of principles, and as abstractions, they sound really good. And then there's the reality of what you're trying to do to apply those principles and translate them into actual programs and actual interventions. And the case examples that they give, the specific cases that they give, like Lisa's discussion of the postal system, are so detailed that you come away with an appreciation for the challenges of going from these sort of highfalutin principles to actually developing them and nurturing them in an actual reality. One thing I wanted to ask, I had an outline, I just want to be sure. Oh yeah, no, there was one quote that I wanted to read, because again, it captures something of the sensibility of the book. And this is an overview of the book. The book addresses society's interest in recognizing both the dignity of the individual in conflict and the collective, shared interest in fair and just systems for preventing, managing, and resolving disputes. If well-designed, dispute systems provide a means for people to step out of pure and not always rational self-interest, and instead to cultivate virtue and reasoning about the common good as it relates to conflict. And I just thought that was one of many really wonderful statements of an ideal and a goal that we should be aspiring to, and especially thinking in the context of the kind of polarization we live in today. This idea of introducing a notion of common good and how do you do that is a particularly important one. One of the things I wonder about, or you have to be mindful of time, because people out there may have questions that they want to ask that are not being
Sure, Howard, I will say if people have questions they'd like to surface, please don't hesitate to put your hand up in Zoom, or you can put something in the chat. It looks like Milan has something, but Howard, finish your point, and then we can open it up to others to participate.
Oh, okay. I sort of lost track of where I was, so.
Sure, if you want to, we can open it up. Milan, what did you want to say?
I have two questions, and one for Jane and one for Lisa. I might start with Jane. When I saw those 6 points, one interested me in particular, which was the concept of transparency on one hand, and then on the other hand, the concept of confidentiality. Mm-hmm. How do you put these together, and how do you allow for transparency to be controlled within the organization or internally versus externally? So that's a question for Jane. And for Lisa, I have a question about what is the inspiration or the thinkers who essentially prompted you to think about justice as fairness? Especially if you mentioned that there are the issues with substantive and procedural aspect of justice. I wanted to kind of add one more type of justice to it and ask you if you incorporated it into the whole design which is a concept of retributive justice, which is the form of control, how the organization literally control within the system. So those were the two questions.
Okay, thank you, Milan. So on that point, gives me a chance to comment a little further on goals, because efficiency, effectiveness, quality of voice, and dignity, those are all wonderful goals that you might aspire to in setting up a process and a system, but somebody's making a decision which is more important. So for the courts, who's included a number of new processes in like early neutral evaluation and mediation, they were expanding the experience, the user experience, as it were, of parties and counsel going to court. And is that more important, that quality of process experience? Yeah, how important is that relative to the cost of running that system? So when California courts cut their budget by 30%, one of the things that went was a lot of their mediation programs, because they could no longer afford to pay the administrators for those processes. So that was a shift from quality of experience as a goal to efficiency as a goal. So thinking about that, so that also raises what you were posing, is what is the role of transparency versus confidentiality and who decides? So as I think about transparency, I think it's in a couple versions. One is transparency of what is the process and how does it work. So that absolutely should be transparent, so that parties and affected parties and users and stakeholders know what the process choice is. How do I enter it? When do I do it? How much does it cost? Which room in the courthouse do I go to get that form? So that kind of transparency on how the processes individually and the system work. The confidentiality, of course, is in tension with the transparency. So we don't want necessarily to have the particulars of a given case to be transparent, although you may want to summarize outcomes so there's a sense of how the process has worked for labor or management parties in previous disputes. So I think there is a tension there. Someone needs to sort it out and balance it, and who that is part of the better design practice. Lisa.
Yes, just to continue the thought on transparency, if you quantify the outcomes of all the cases and the results of all the exit surveys, you can share the results and be completely transparent about the function of the system as a whole. So over the course of evaluating the Postal Service, the team, and at one point I had 27 students working on this project. The team published at least 20 articles with data showing what people thought about the system, comparing what they thought about the system if you used an inside neutral mediator who was an employee of the Postal Service, as opposed to an outside contractor. Not surprisingly, people thought the system was more fair with an outside contractor, right? Rather than a coworker who was responsible to management. There are ways of being completely transparent about the system as a whole, but that requires money, because you got to collect the data. Somebody's got to enter it. Somebody's got to analyze it. Then it's got to be published. And the Postal Service, during the era that I worked with them, was publishing the data by region. They had 85 regions when I was working with them, collected zip codes, and we could break down the exit surveys by zip code. And so people managing a system in a region could see how people felt about how it was working in a given zip code. And in some cases, we could break it. Basically, since we had 50 cases, we had the same pattern pop up. in terms of procedural justice data. So I just wanted to say that about transparency, because we do say in the book that it's important to try to evaluate the system to make it accountable. And that's why one of the chapters is on evaluation. Now, going back to this question of justice, we do mention retributive justice in the community chapter in contrast to restorative justice. We actually didn't do a chapter on the criminal justice system, which is an omission, I think. There are other, in retrospect, you look back and you think, oh, wow, we needed chapters on this, that, and the other thing that we didn't include. But we also wanted to live long enough to get the book published, and it took 13 years. So that said, the sources, Milan, for the definitions of justice came from John Rawls, from books in jurisprudence, from the procedural justice authors Tyler and Lynn, Tom Tyler and E. Allen Lynn, who is active and producing a lot at, Tyler's at Yale Law School right now, and Lynn is at Berkeley in the Public Policy School. And all of that work goes on. There was also jurisprudence work done by various legal scholars that got incorporated into the definition. So a variety of sources, Aristotle, it's not coming from any one place. The point about fairness versus justice. Now, this actually was multiple conversations between me and Stephanie, into which Jan would intervene. Stephanie was more comfortable with the word fairness, and I was more comfortable with the word justice. And so we use both, right? And I don't know that any one definition of fairness came out of the book. Jan, am I misremembering?
No, I think that's right, that we struggled with it.
Yeah, I just one note, because I want to give other people opportunity. The Rawlsian theory is that justice is fairness. So I was thinking, if you were able to essentially utilize it and put it together, it might kind of help a little bit. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate both answers.
Before I go on, is there anyone else who has a question they want to ask at this point?
I just wanted to ask if you could put up the slide of the first part of the first three elements, because I didn't quite capture them.
Okay.
From the framework.
Yes.
While Jan is doing that, I just want to say hi to Don Greenstein, because he was involved in the very early stages from pretty much the beginning of the redress program at the Postal Service. So a contact for you if you want to hear what I'm not saying.
While people are looking at that, I wanted to ask a question that goes in a slightly different direction. The subtitle of the book is Preventing, Managing, and Resolving Conflict. And I think it's fair to say that of those three, prevention gets the least attention in your book. And one of the things that plagues some of us in the conflict world is we understand the value of managing and resolving conflicts. We also understand the value of conflict as a stimulus to change. And so when we talk about preventing conflict, we have to think about crossing the boundary from some kind of, from prevention to repression, is the simplest way of it. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on where does the prevention part come in dispute system design? And what are the features that of a dispute system that allow for the emergence of the kind of conflict that leads to creative change um, without damaging the, negatively affecting the stakeholders.
I actually have a quick answer.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't do a good job on preventing, but I can give you an example of where it I think did. So one of the weird things that happened in the Postal Service program was these managers against whom complaints were being filed hadn't necessarily had much training in conflict management. And so their first experience of it was in mediation, where they had to actually listen to somebody else. And one of the weird things that happened was pretty early in the program, there developed something that the Postal Service named, I think they named it pre-mediation, where once a supervisor knew there was a complaint filed, they would actually talk to the employee and the case would get withdrawn or dropped. And that rate started out, when they first started measuring it, it was like 15% of the cases. And I think it got up to 25% by the time I stopped being involved with the program.
Interesting.
So it's, and the Postal Service never called that preventing conflict.
Yeah.
They called it moving conflict resolution upstream. In other words, earlier in the conflict's birth.
Jan?
Yes, Lorraine, are you caught up?
Thank
okay.
you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to see everybody again.
I do have another question, if there is time.
I want to just add a couple things onto Howard's question. I think around prevention, it's just some purposeful deliberation in whatever the underlying content, substantive relationship is, that there is a conversation about what can go wrong here. And if it does, how do we want to handle it? In some cases, so two examples that I can share. One is from Colin's world with eBay. Many of us may have had disputes on eBay, didn't get what we wanted, didn't come on time, it was broken. So the real intervention there is the more that information that the parties have on the travel time delivery, the less they were likely to have complaints if they knew when their product was showing up. So that's a matter of just information, getting information to people. This is what's happening. This is what to expect. A different version of that is with the ombuds that was and mediators who were designed as part of the Kaiser rebuild of their arbitration system. So they've experimented with having a mediator on call at the hospital. He's not allowed to join committees even. He has to sit in his office all the time because if there is a call from a patient with a physician and is distressed by the way the conversation is going or the treatment, there's an opportunity to call that third party neutral to come and participate and intervene at that point in time. So I would call that, just an edge upstream from a complaint. If a person is distressed and they have an opportunity to sort it out sooner than later, that would be a form of prevention. But I think the larger picture that you laid out, Howard, is mostly having a conversation about how does this process work? At what point does it engage?
That example of Jan's, I mean, there was the first dispute system design book, right? Getting Disputes Resolved by Uri Brett and Goldberg.
Yep.
And that reminds me of the example where Bill Uri was on 24-hour call in the coal mines in order to prevent the wildcat strikes. And lo and behold, it worked.
Yeah. Before I go, anyone else have a question? I can't see all the screens at once.
I have a quick comment about, like, in terms of the
Okay.
aspect of informal dispute resolution. Part of my training and my client load is doing conflict coaching, which can sometimes be a way before they even get to mediation that they,
Mhm.
you can, I work with them separately, then sometimes bring them together. And I've been very successful helping them resolve things. And
Mhm.
at the same time, I've been called several times into one company, and I've been saying to them, if this pattern keeps coming up over and over of these kinds of problems, you're having me put out fires instead of proactively managing conflict more in lines with what you're talking about. So I actually teach a class on conflict management, and one of the weeks is called A Vision for the Future. And it's all about, okay, you've got these skills to help people resolve conflicts, but what would it look like if organizations were being proactive? Because it's just so important to grapple with things on that level, if we can, with human limits and paying more attention to fires.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in part, I asked that question, Lisa, because when you described the postal office situation where they required these conversations between the person who had a issue and the person above them with whom they had the issue.
It was voluntary. The system,
Okay,
the person with the issue did not have to mediate.
Okay, it was just an opportunity to talk, no, the preliminary conversation before the mediation.
Yeah, that preliminary conversation that arose spontaneously. And
okay.
I think the managers were initiating them. But they
And
weren't
but
required.
that's where your warnings about the differences in power between management and employees comes in. So the question of voluntariness arises when someone lower down in the power hierarchy has some concerns about someone higher up in the power hierarchy. It reminds me of the dynamic that existed years ago when sensitivity training was all the rage. And what would often be an outcome of people going through sensitivity training is that the lower status people came away now with the additional burden, not only to have to be responsive to the people with power, but to be concerned about their feelings. So it had the opposite from the liberating effect it was supposed to have.
Yeah, the idea that an organization that was at the time, although it is considerably smaller now, right? I mean, at the time the program was started, I think there were 940,000 employees, which made it the largest civilian employer in the world. And the thing to understand about the EEO system was you had people filing as many as 50 EEO complaints a year. So it was, and because it was a federal sector employer with various protections, 7 unions, it's a unionized employer, employees could file both at the same time, an EEO complaint and a collective bargaining grievance, and have those going on in parallel. So while I remember Susan Silby at a Law and Society conference, as soon as I mentioned the Postal Service and the system, just tearing me apart about the power imbalance. What I tried to explain is, okay, well, what are the alternatives? Right? Before the system, their supervisor never had to sit down and actually listen to them without interruption.
Which is a real improvement in some ways. But it's also, I mean, it points to a systemic flaw in the organization, because as the EEO system is set up, when people don't have confidence in the grievance systems within their organizations, they know that the EEO system will have more teeth than the grievance system. So they squeeze non-EEO grievances into the EEO format as a way of hoping to have some leverage in getting their issue addressed.
And
But
that
that's a
was,
larger, I mean, that's a multiple layers above of systemic failure.
there's a geographic pattern that happens in the South, in the Postal Service more than the North.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Other questions out there? I want to shift direction a little. There's some mention of ODR and it's come up here. But as we all know, ODR is getting a whole lot more attention since COVID and the retreat from processes that traditionally bring people together physically. And I wonder if you have, after this past year's or year and a half's experiences, is ODR a game changer? Are there supplementary reflections you have about ODR that you'd like to offer in relation to dispute system design? You're muted, Jan.
Absolutely. I do believe it is a game changer, and one of the leaders in the field is our own Colin. But I think online processes are have a couple different dimensions. One is it's an efficiency, as we've all used in the last couple of years. It's easier and question whether it's more accessible and whether it advances access to justice by being more accessible in terms of process and such, and information. So the increase in information and the ease of process access is a huge shift. It also changes the quality of the interaction though as well. So whether you're in a textual communication or video or both, or a combination, and who decides and who has the technical capacity and available resources. So I think it's merged together. Colin and Leo Wing and Ethan Katch and I wrote an article in the Negotiation Journal on designing ethical online systems, the rise of the fourth party. So the fourth party is the computer, the capacity that online brings to supplement and juxtapose with the existing processes that were there. And I think over time, the introduction of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the gathering of data, the use of algorithms in predicting outcomes or determining outcomes at some point. And so there's a whole array of questions that we need to wrestle with. Is what are our underlying goals for this category of dispute or conflict, and how can this tool advance at being a choice? I think using online processes and or face-to-face processes, ideally parties will have a choice that they will decide, I want the speed and accessibility of online, and examples are family law and divorce software programs and platforms now are making it easier for parties to go online, file their interests, rank their priorities, and have a mediator perhaps come in and help them work through some of the more difficult issues. So that's a combination of online, video, textual, asynchronous versus synchronous. So this mix and match your processes that are available thanks to the online options. Lisa, you may want to speak to the access to justice issue.
Well, I think I don't necessarily want to speak to that because I think we're all aware that we've got inequality of, I mean, in Tennessee, it's against the law for a community in Appalachia to have its own internet utility, or so
Really?
we've got major issues. But the only thing I have to add, I think, and Jan got everything. The only thing I can add is there's some great research being done on how these systems operate. And Jean Brett was one of the lead authors on a piece of work on the eBay system a decade or more ago in the Academy of Management Journal called Sticks and Stones. And it was about the way the system was set up to rewrite, change the language of a complaint, or whether the complaint was by the buyer or the seller, so that the opposing party could receive the complaint and not immediately get defensive and angry. And it, it worked. It helped people save face, was one of the theories. But I wonder to what degree people knew that was happening to the wording in their complaint.
Colin, do you want to speak to this a bit?
I'm deciding whether or not to engage with all this eBay stuff. I will take, first of all, the parties did know that when they went through and made selections in a form, we compiled the language for their message, and then we ran it by them and said, hey, this is what we're going to say. Is this correct or is this incorrect? And if you want to make a change, you can go back. But I think it is an interesting idea. I did post a link to the fourth party concept, and it was Ethan and Janet Rifkin that originally came up with the idea of the fourth party. I think it's a very interesting thing to factor into dispute systems design. So obviously I'm biased, but I do think it is ODR is a game changer. I will say Bob Bordone's system design book did a really deep dive on the eBay system too. Yeah. And one of the reasons why I think the first people that got ODR in the dispute resolution field were the dispute systems design people, because it's a way to make dispute systems design tangible. When you write it into code and you write web pages and you have structures and people have to click through it, I can come up with a dispute systems design on paper, and then, people will violate it or change the rules or jump to stage 3 and skip stage 2. But when you write it in software, boy, that dispute systems design, you can't get out of it, because that's the mode that people are interacting through. So I think there's a real resonance between ODR and DSD. And I find that in the students, when Jan and I teach our ODR and DSD class, and we ask them to design systems, they really get it because they know how to design software. If you ask them to design a workplace dispute resolution process, sometimes they're like, well, I don't know what would work and what wouldn't. But if you say, hey, write a software program to do this, well, then they get it. Then they understand the flows, because you really have to take all this DSD framework advice to heart if you're designing a software program. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Colin.
One last thing, Colin, just to put the pressure on you. Are there ways in which reading Lisa and Jan's and Stephanie's book altered some of your thinking about online dispute resolution?
Absolutely. I love this book. I'm on record saying that I'm sort of obsessed with it. I think when Lisa was talking about fairness versus justice, that's a conversation we've had within Modria many times. Because I, as a non-lawyer, I'm reluctant to assume the mantle of justice. To me, that seems like, the blindfolded lady with the scales. That's not really the way I think about what I do. I'm really trying to help parties find a resolution. So we talk a lot about fast and fair resolutions. But in the book, when we talk about justice, when we talk about conceptions of justice, it made me think a lot about what is it that I'm doing? What am I doing when I design these systems? And I realized I'm a procedural justice guy. So I think a lot about process. And I say, if we can all agree on a process in advance of a dispute, we say, yeah, this process is fair. Well, I may disagree with an outcome, but I agreed that the process was fair. So I have to, that outcome may still be just, even though I feel like the individual outcome may be unjust. But then when we talk about outcome-based processes, that's much more like the artificial intelligence, where you have sort of a black box and the algorithm is going through and it's making determinations that we might not even understand as humans. It's beyond our ability to comprehend what it's doing. So we can only evaluate the outcomes. And is that okay? Because the justice of an outcome is very much in the eye of the beholder, where we may all agree on a process. I'm also a huge fan of moving upstream, preventing disputes. At eBay, we realize that's the most effective way to resolve a dispute is to prevent it. If you're just dealing reactively with all the disputes, it's Sisyphusian. So Everything that we've talked about, everything the book addresses. I mean, literally, again, I'm biased because Jan and I co-teach a class and we present all of the framework to our students. And then we say, okay, let's apply this to ODR. But for me, it's hand in glove. I think when law students say to me, what am I going to do when all the legal jobs are gone away because algorithms are doing it in 20 years? I say, read this book. This is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be designing the systems and coding them, and then the robots are going to go do it. But somebody has to tell the robots what to do, and that's DSD. So that's why I think this is the future of the field. Just as much as ODR and technology is the future of dispute resolution practice, I think DSD, we're going to be designing the systems that will administer themselves, as opposed to being the individual mediators and arbitrators handling each case. So okay, I'm sorry, I can go on and on.
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, the discussion of fairness and justice that runs through the book is one of the most powerful parts of it, and thought-provoking parts of it. It just pushed me around many times as I would go through one section or the other. So. Were you about to say something, Jen? Okay. Again, anyone out there with questions?
There were a couple points surfaced in the chat. Claire, I don't know if you wanted to loop back. I think you had a really great talking about quantifying qualitative factors. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I hate raising such a big question when we're over time, but perhaps if you could answer it quickly, or maybe just suggest an article. The piece that I always find fascinating is how you can quantify the qualitative. So in other words, we do all of these great soft skills, and a lot of, it seems to me like a lot of your end goals when you're designing, when you're improving a system, is to improve the soft skills. In other words, to improve the qualitative. Are people getting along better? Are they happier at work? Is it more respectful? So I was wondering, what are some of your tips for quantifying that? In other words, for justifying it or showing to management, yeah, we did make a change. Things are better here. And it's not just a squishy feeling, but we can point to a set of numbers or objectives that have been met. Do you have, again, I know we're over time, but if you have any quick thoughts on that, I would love them.
There's a fabulous team of people at the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. They are it's David Lipsky and all of his students, Ariel Afgar, Alex Colvin, and others. And there's a big body of literature in organizational justice about employee citizenship behaviors. And if you have a good grievance procedure or complaint system, and it wasn't always, the language of dispute system design wasn't used in this literature until more recently, right? But things like attendance, things like productivity, things like members of a team being able to resolve conflict, being able to compare different teams. I mean, there are all sorts of things you can look at that suggest that the conflict management piece of things is working. At least you can compare it before and after. You can look at complaint streams. And that was one of the studies we did. We did a time series of complaint filings before and after the redress program, and they dropped by at least 25% in terms of formal complaints. I'm not talking about the pre-mediation stuff. Right. I'm talking about somebody files an EEO complaint. There's the first stage, an investigation, and then a formal hearing. The formal hearing rate dropped by 25%. So there is stuff you can look at. And you can also look at morale surveys. So the federal government does morale surveys every quarter, different samples.
Got it. Thank you. Very helpful.
The only thing I would add to that, Claire, is I know there's research included in the Pew evaluation on the online piece, but also Donna Shostowski's work on courts and processes goes to people's experience, and it's in a qualitative way. sense of being heard, sense of fair process, that sort of thing, that I think gets at that partially.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Before we move on, anyone else out there has a question they want to be able to ask? So two other things I wanted to bring up. One is somewhere in the book, you quote Deborah Hensler's concern, where she says, what do we gain and what do we lose when public dispute resolution becomes private and private decision makers acquire the ability to resolve disputes with significant public policy consequences?
Mhm.
I wonder if you would want to talk a bit to that.
It's a big question,
Yeah.
Howard. And I do think about it because very often it's not deliberated. It creeps, right? And I see it in the international arena, particularly with international arbitration, investor state arbitration, and thinking about climate change issues now, which is a huge public policy issue, but it's getting conflated with the specifics of an investor state dispute. And that is under a very circumscribed arbitration process. And so can the arbitrator incorporate some public policy questions in that decision? And is it appropriate? Is that what they've hired the arbitral panel to do? Probably not. So I think certainly at a micro level, it is manifest as well. So I don't have a crisp answer to that. I think being conscious to the extent one can, if you are lucky enough to be an academic or public policy advisor to a process, to raise those issues. So at least it's consciously deliberated.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't expect a crisp answer. I didn't think there
Yeah.
was one. And the answer is above my pay level. So that's
Yeah,
why I
yeah.
wanted to hear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for the making the point, because the thing that I think most of America does not realize is adhesive arbitration is suppressing justice. It's suppressing complaint filing. David Will wrote a great book on the fractured workplace, and he was under the Obama administration the director of the Wage and Hour Office of the US Department of Justice. And at a conference, he said, we have no way of measuring the degree to which these arbitration clauses, which now cover 75% of workers, the degree to which they are suppressing the enforcement of things like the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yeah. We're from what Claire said, I guess we're close to running out of time. So let me give you another impossible to answer question, but I'm just curious if you have some thoughts about this. So given the deep and pervasive polarization that characterizes socio-political discourse in this country, what kind of guidance would you provide for ways of addressing these differences and moderating the polarizations? Are there fora or systems or occasions that could be developed that in your dreams you say, well, if only I could, if I were the czarina of this is what we would have people do?
May I
Go ahead, Lisa.
Lawyers are not taught how to behave in public meetings as members of multi-member public agencies. So for example, your city council. It is not legally required in the vast majority of states that under the sunshine laws, city councils let people even have 3 minutes at the microphone. This is a major flaw in administrative law at the state and the federal level. The philanthropic world is beginning to see the problem. So we got a team here in Bloomington got a $640,000 grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do a public engagement process where you convene groups of people to have dialogue and deliberation over the making of health policy, particularly elevating the voices of underserved communities. There is a Stronger Democracy award offered by the MacArthur Foundation that is an effort to find creative ways to address this failure of people are in information silos, and there are not avenues for them to talk to each other. And law schools are not teaching lawyers how to do this and how important it is. The ABA adopted Resolution 108 unanimously in the House of Delegates, a product of the Task Force on Civility, urging lawyers to be role models in that arena in the public sphere.
Thank you. Jan, did you?
Well, I just have a micro example to follow on Lisa. I am teaching a mini version of my system design class to 1Ls this fall. And so they're coming fresh into the law school. So I'm pretty excited about the opportunity to talk to them about what system design might look like. And it ranges from working with the San Francisco District Attorney in designing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to online dispute resolution to everything in between. So they have a sense of choice in process design and how the formal legal process that they're focused on now fits within a larger array of options.
Well, I think we are getting close to the end of our allotted time. I have one last question for you, and that is, and the nice thing about this is you can answer as arbitrators. It's common for people, including practitioners, to refer to conflict resolution as a field. But Peter Adler, who has been with us for a while here, likes to say that we are not, in fact, a field. We're too varied and disparate to define a coherent entity. So, yes or no? Are we a field? Is there a field of conflict resolution? It's not binding arbitration because Peter wouldn't listen to me.
I don't see it as a field. It's something, and I don't know what the word is for it. It's a dimension because it overlays everything. It's everywhere. It's all around us. And how we name it and try to compartmentalize it according to certain elements or qualities helps us deal with it in a useful way. But I don't know that it makes it a field.
Okay. Thank you.
Lisa?
It's a skill set that is being institutionalized across disciplines. So I would have said it was a field 15 years ago, but watching the section of dispute resolution lose its territory to each other section of the bar that's setting up its own specialized chunk of the field related to their arena of practice. I'm delighted, actually. Your course sounds wonderful. I think it should be a required first-year course everywhere. I should, it's not like the material is getting required in graduate schools of business or in graduate schools of public affairs. It should be mandatory curriculum in the professional schools. But I don't know, I can't call it a field. I think I have to call it a skill set.
Thank you. If nothing else, we've redeemed Peter, which is a worthwhile accomplishment because he needs redemption. Thank you both for a wonderful discussion of an absolutely great book. It's I loved reading it. As I said, it really pushed me around and opened me up to thinking about things that I hadn't. And then listening to you and having the chance to talk with you has just enhanced my appreciation of it. And everyone should have one of these on their desk, and they should open it up and start reading. So, and
Thank you.
Colin, thank you again for creating this series.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Howard, for
Yes.
hosting us.
Howard, you did an excellent job. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Howard.
Thank you. Howard, it's wonderful to have such an intuitive, informed, and wonderful reader give us feedback on the book and host you and Colin host this event, because it's been a hard year and a half to try to share something new. And this is a wonderful way to do it. So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you,
Okay.
Colin.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for
Thanks,
attending.
everyone.
Be well. Have a great weekend.
Okay.
And we'll see each other again soon. Okay.
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 Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye.